Despite all of the amazing and complex machines built by engineers, inventors, and scientists alike, the human brain still remains the most complicated thing in the known universe. With its 100 billion neurons all working together to create the mysterious concept of consciousness, how exactly does the brain work? How are messages sent from one part of the brain to another? And what do the different sections of the brain do? To answer these questions, one first needs to understand how the most basic element of the brain works, the neuron. There are three main parts of the neuron that deal with communication: the dendrites, axon, and the axon terminals. The dendrites are finger-like appendages on one end of the neuron that detect special chemicals called neurotransmitters, which cross the gap between neurons called synapses. Once these neurotransmitters reach their respective receptor in the dendrites, the neuron then fires an action potential from one end of the neuron to another through the axon. The axon is the wire-like tube along which the action potential travels as an electrochemical wave. The axon can range from microscopic length to over 3 feet long. Once the action potential reaches the end of the axon, it is transmitted to the next neuron through the axon terminal. The axon terminal then releases neurotransmitters to allow the next neuron to fire. Thus, the electrical message is able to continue through the rest of the body until it reaches its destination. By doing this, the brain and nervous system is able to handle a constant inflow and outflow of information. There are 6 main areas of the brain, each tasked with processing different types of information. The first and most basic part of the brain is the brainstem, which is located at the top of the spinal cord as it enters the skull. The brainstem controls the processes that are critical for survival, such as breathing, heartbeat, and digestion. At the top of the brainstem is the thalamus, which acts as a switchboard, routing sensory information to the appropriate processing center in the brain. Right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which deals with urges such as hunger, sleep, and the fight or flight response. Also located in the brainstem is the medulla and the pons, which work together to regulate our breathing, heart rate, and sleep. The second main area of the brain is the frontal lobe, which helps with emotional control, the ability to plan for future events, concentration, and other higher thinking abilities. This area of the brain is also mostly undeveloped in adolescent teens, while the hypothalamus is fully developed. Because of this, teenagers are more susceptible to making poor decisions based on urges instead of logical reasoning. Also located in the frontal lobe is the motor cortex, which controls muscle movement. The motor cortex controls the body from the bottom up, meaning the top of the motor cortex in the brain controls the lowest parts of the body. Adding complexity though, the part of the motor cortex on the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and vice versa. The area of the motor cortex also gives more area to the parts of the body that need the most precision movement, like the fingers. Since this area is still somewhat undeveloped in teens, they tend to be more clumsy. The third major area of the brain is the temporal lobe, which controls hearing and speech. Also contained in the temporal lobe is the hippocampus, which controls learning and forms new memories. Fourth is the parietal lobe, which controls your senses. Inside the parietal lobe is the somatosensory cortex, which processes the feeling of touch, with the left hemisphere processing the right side of the body and vice versa. It is laid out like the motor cortex, except instead of controlling muscle movements, it processes touch. Fifth is the occipital lobe, which processes visual information, and like the other parts of the brain, which part of the body the brain controls is flipped. The only difference here is that the left hemisphere doesn't directly process the right eye. The left hemisphere actually processes the right visual field of both eyes. The right hemisphere then processes the left visual field of both eyes. Together, these 4 lobes of the brain form what is known as the cerebral cortex, which is the wrinkly surface of the brain. The last main area of the brain is the corpus callosum, which connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain and allows for information to be sent between the 2. So working together, the 2 halves of the brain can control the whole body. How did psychologists figure out what part of the brain controls what though? The first method psychologists use is an EEG, or electroencephalogram, which records the electrical signals from different parts of the brain through the use of electrodes. By doing this, psychologists can determine what parts of the brain respond to different behaviors. A similar method to this is PET, or positron emission tomography, which instead of using electrodes to measure brain activity, uses special radioactive glucose. As the brain processes stuff, it uses that glucose for energy, so special machinery can create a map of the brain based on which areas are using that glucose. The third main method psychologists use is stimulation, which involves delivering an electric shock to certain parts of the brain in order to see what is affected. For example, if an area is shocked and the subject feels a sensation in their leg, then scientists can determine that that area of the brain controls feeling in the leg. The fourth method psychologists use is called lesioning, in which parts of the brain are carefully removed in order to see what is affected. Perhaps the most famous lesioning study conducted was that on Phineas Gage, who was a rail worker in the 1800s who had a large iron spike sent cleanly through his brain. He survived the accident, but his behavior changed quite drastically. After the accident, he was much more impulsive and immature, when normally he was respected for his leadership and responsibility. Considering that the frontal lobe was what was damaged by the spike, it was then determined that the frontal lobe must then control judgment and emotional processing. Another such study involved a man named Victor Leborgne, I can't speak French, who could only produce the sound tan. Upon his death, famous psychologist Paul Broca examined his brain and found a lesion in his left frontal lobe. This area, now known as Broca's area, is part of the brain that controls the muscle movements allowed to make sounds, or speech. Broca was able to determine this because Victor, although unable to speak, was able to understand what was said to him. This combined with the fact that this particular area in the brain was damaged allowed him to conclude that Broca's area only controlled the ability to make speech. So through the damage or surgical lesioning, psychologists can determine what parts of the brain can do what based on what behavior is changed or removed. In the same realm as lesioning, there is a relatively recent branch of psychology known as split brain research, which focuses on patients who have had their corpus callosum severed for medical reasons. Since the corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres of the brain, severing it means that the two hemispheres can no longer communicate, forcing them to act somewhat independently from one another. Through various experiments with split brain patients, psychologists were able to determine that there was some degree of hemispheric specialization of the brain, meaning that the left hemisphere was better at doing some stuff than the right hemisphere, and vice versa. In an experiment where a split brain patient saw words flashed on two sides of a line, they were able to read words flashed on the right side of the screen, but not the left side. This combined with the known fact that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body helps psychologists to realize that the left hemisphere controls speech, at least in most people, unless you're, left-handed, and the right hemisphere is better at spatial processing. This explains why the patient can't see the words flashed on the left side, since the left side of the screen is processed visually by the right hemisphere, which, as it turns out, lacks the language processing center, or Broca's area, and Wernicke's area, and those other areas, that would allow them to recognize something they saw as a word, so they just say they saw nothing. As psychologists continue to perform more experiments, and as scientists develop new instruments to measure the brain with more precision, we are able to gain an ever-growing knowledge of our own brains. But now that scientists have answered the questions of how our brain sends messages and what controls what, psychologists can start to tackle the most complex and difficult question of all in neuroscience: what is consciousness?